All right. Well, thanks for continually joining me here on the podcast, Jason Farley Substack. Today, I'm going to take a quick intermission from what we've been working through with the idea that Christianity is a religion. It's not a Gnostic spirituality. It is. It's not something that just simply happens inside our head, inside our heart, that's transforming, but it actually touches the world, changes everything, and that it changes it through the normal processes of history. Right? It changes us. It changes the world. It changes our societies. It changes our cities. It changes our towns. It has a transformative, a converting effect. It's a converting religion. But I wanted to give it some. I wanted to give that some specific examples of how that has worked throughout history. Some stories from church history. Because God picks up in history, He picks us up in the flesh. He takes our real history and He grafts it covenantally into God's people. And that's what Paul is talking about when he says that we are grafted in. We have a way of individualizing that, meaning that my heart, my mind is grafted into God's people. But really, our whole story is reframed, is inserted into God's people, and our history becomes a part of the history of God's people because all of us is brought in to God's people. Is all of us is got brought into God's story, and I wanted to just compare two different ancient church or early church missionaries, the early medieval missionaries, really, and show the two different ways that God has sent out missionaries, because both of these are examples of effective missionaries, but it's very, very different. The first one is Saint Boniface, and he has been growing in popularity. He's mostly known for chopping down Thor's oak tree. And my youngest son's middle name is Saint Boniface. I mean, he's a hero of mine. I really look up to him a lot. He's a great preacher. We've got some of his writings, and he's really worth the time. Because he was a brilliant man, but also incredibly courageous a missionary. And his story is really important. Well, he goes up. He is down in Italy. He's working really kind of as a theologian. He's training other pastors. And what happens is some people come back from being sent up to the Germanic peoples, and they come back and they say they're never going to convert. It's like plowing fields of iron up there. And so he goes to his bishop and says, please send me. I want to prove that God can plow fields of iron. And he goes up there. He's older. He gets up there and he's working, and he's having actually really a slow going in terms of conversions. He's been there for a while. And one day he sees a lot of people walking out into the woods. And he says, where's everybody going? And he says, well, we're heading out to Thor's oak tree. And he says, oh, I'll come too. And so he goes and he gets his axe, as well as some of the other missionaries that they're working with. And they head out. And when they find Thor's oak tree and people worshiping Thor's oak out there, they step up and they begin to chop it down. And everybody assumes that they're going to be killed, right? Because they're coming into contact with Thor's oak. But instead, they're able to chop it down, and it took a long time. And they finish, and he steps up onto the he steps up onto the stump of Thor's oak, and he says, "Now you see that my God is stronger." And a lot of people convert at that point. He presents the gospel, they come to the Lord, they get baptized, and he ends up building the first chapel out of the wood from Thor's oak tree. Right? It's a very confrontational means of sharing the gospel, and it's effective. Right? We still talk about the ministry of Saint Boniface because even though he was martyred not too long after that, he really does get the first foothold amongst the Germanic people. in terms of sharing the gospel and presenting the gospel, and God used him in that very particular confrontive way, right? And it worked. But there are other missionaries that did other things, some amongst the Germanic people, some amongst the Anglo-Saxons, that weren't that the same sort of style, that were more of a real new wine into old wineskins type of situation, where they showed up with the gospel, and they began sharing the gospel and preaching the gospel. And in the same sort of way that Boniface doesn't have immediate conversions, there's some time where they're building trust, and and learning the language, because it's a completely different language, and the Germanic peoples didn't have the history of building out their reasoning by means of careful philosophy and logic studies. That's those sorts of arguing. They built out their reasoning skills. They built the strength of their wisdom by using poetry, and by using riddles, and by that using stories with twists and turns and wordplay, that sort of thing. And so the missionaries would learn the language, and often they would learn this particular kind of way of communicating, this poetic logic, this riddle type of communication, and then learn how to share the gospel in that format, in within the language, because the gospel was transcending and going across linguistic boundaries, right? So you didn't have to teach them Latin so that they could learn the gospel. They would translate the gospel into Anglo-Saxon. And when later during the Reformation, when they have to make a legal case for the translation of the gospel into English, the part of what they do is they look back at these missionaries and they say, look, we've got the gospel in English, all the way back to these early missionaries in the 7th century. And they showed up, and they translate the gospel into English. They translate the book of Genesis into English. They translate portions of the Old Testament. They translate a harmony of the Gospels into English right away. And so when they're making a legal case, they say, look, this is what we've always done. That's just as an aside, because at the time, as they translated it in, there were things that there were ways of thinking, there were imaginative ways of thinking that that didn't match up in a one-to-one correlation when they went to share the gospel, when they went to explain what salvation was, how it worked. But they found some things that really did translate straight across. One of them was the Yggdrasil tree, right? It was a myth of at the end of each phase of the world, that you had a fall and a winter of history, and before it could come back around to spring, the whole world would have to pass through fire. Well, there was a tree, an Yggdrasil tree, that would take in the last 2 humans, and then they would be saved through that final judgment of the earth. And then the earth would be resurrected or reborn out of the fire. But the tree was the salvation of humanity in the midst of this seasonal shape of history. Well, what happened is the missionaries heard this story, and they said, "Oh, actually, that is a poetic or a wisdom category, and really it's kind of a riddle shaped category that they say that can help us share the gospel." You've got all kinds of poets that they get converted, and they begin writing poets in the Anglo-Saxon poetry in that Anglo-Saxon style to communicate the stories. One of which would be the Dream of the Rood. Rood is the Anglo-Saxon word for cross, and so it's the story of Jesus's death and resurrection told from the perspective of the cross. The cross is the narrator of the story. Well, what's amazing in the Dream of the Rood is it uses some of the most important aspects of the Yggdrasil tree myth, but instead of the Yggdrasil being the tree through which humanity is saved, it takes those same sorts of phrases and images, and it makes the cross into the tree through which the humanity is saved, right? So instead of the Yggdrasil tree trembling at the coming judgment of history, the rood, the cross, it trembles when it sees Christ coming towards it, right? And it comes to understand that the reason, or it comes to explain that the reason that the cross is salvation for the human race is because Jesus, the God man, hung on the cross, right? And it's not just it's not that we're so good. He talks about how when we approach the cross, that we approach the cross as sinful creatures, as sinful men. And so that we're not just saved by the cycle, we're not saved through just the cycles of history anymore, but we're actually saved from the final judgment where God comes, or that Christ returns and the judgment happens with the burning of his judgment, but we're saved through being in the cross, is the way they end up putting it, right? And that's because instead of being saved in the Yggdrasil tree, the way humanity was saved, it actually isn't the right tree to retreat to, right? We actually retreat to the cross because Christ died on the cross, right? And so it's a metaphorical, poetic way of taking the whole of what Christ did, it through the uh, uh, taking that taking it as a metaphor that says the whole for the part. You talk about one part of what's happened in as a way of talking about the whole, and it's a normal poetic way of doing things. And the Dream of the Rood, the entire thing, is that kind of poem. And at the same time, you have Gregory, the bishop that sent the missionaries, writing letters back and forth with the missionaries, with Augustine, and he's talking about how to bring these folks in. What are we need? As they get converted, they have a different system of. They have different architecture. They have different rituals, or all of this sort of thing. And he talks to them. We've got these letters that they write back and forth as they sift through which of these things are they bringing in because it's just the human parts of their lives, and which of these things are attached to their paganism, right? Because they're pagans becoming Christians, but what's being saved out of their paganism is their humanity, right? The paganism has been attacking their humanity, and the Christianity that their following of Christ, it brings them in as humans. So what does it look like for these Angles and Saxons and Jutes and Picts and Celts and for these people to be grafted in, for their story, their history, to actually be joined to the history of God's people and become part of the story of God's salvation of the world. Well, they have this really amazing discussion in their letters about the temples, these pagan temples themselves, right? That you've got buildings, and they wrestle through it, and they say, well, obviously the altar that has sacrificial blood on it, that has been used to defile and God, says that needs to be taken out and burned, right? So you've got a village converts, or the king or the lord, the sheriff, the leader of the shire, the leader of the county, is converted, and so they are. You don't really have this sort of sacred secular divide. The same person would be in charge of the temple. That would be, it would have a civil role, but he gets converted, and so now he says, well, we're getting rid of the paganism, right? The people would kind of convert. You'd say, our tribe's coming in, and so what do we do? And what they decided was, well, we get rid of the altar, but you don't have to actually tear the whole building down, right? Because the building, can be still used. The building, space as space is neutral, right? Space as space is a good thing that God created. So we don't have to move to a different space. We can still keep using the same space, but we're going to get rid of the we're going to get rid of the altar itself, because that is the place where the images, the created things, were worshipped. So they take those out, they break them up, they burn them, all sorts of things, and then they begin having worship in these buildings. But what's amazing is the buildings were actually built to look to they were built in the shape of trees, because of this Yggdrasil tree myth. And often they would have tree shaped doors, or large trees carved into the door. And what they would do is they would take those the images of the trees, and they would carve into them the shape of a cross, right? So that the Yggdrasil tree was being converted, and the Yggdrasil tree was bowing down now. It was turning its eyes to the light of Christ. Because the Yggdrasil tree was a pine tree that was a symbol, because of its evergreen nature. It was a symbol of spring's victory over winter. It was the symbol of life's victory over death by means of resurrection. And they said, well, that is actually true. That symbolism is something that you, as a people, drew from God's creation. It's poetically in line with reality, right? So that can be converted. Whereas the altars, where they were worshiping images, that's specifically forbidden, right? So that they would break up, right? And so they actually would sift through what is being brought in that's a simple human thing, that's a good thing, and what's being brought in that's something that's attacking the humanity of these people. And we don't, for example, they would have a child sacrifice up in the Germanic areas, in Woden's Grove, which is a bunch of small, it's a grove full of pine trees, and when they found out that was going on, they stopped that immediately. They would chop down the groves. In fact, that's the reason that we hang wreaths on our doors at Christmas time, because they would cut the pieces of the groves where they did child sacrifice up, and they would hang them as a reminder that God no longer requires you to sacrifice your children. He sacrificed his son, so you never have to sacrifice one of your children again, right? And so we hang a wreath to this day to remind us that we don't sacrifice children. The child sacrifice is not something that we ought to do. So, this is, I think there needs to be, a wreath march around Planned Parenthoods and things like that, because the real way to stop child sacrifice is for everyone to look at God's sacrifice of his child on our behalf, right? And then the resurrection of that child that transforms him from the lowest, like Philippians talks about, he took on the lowest place, dying even the death on the cross, in order to, because that was the path to the highest place, to the King of Kings, right? And so now all child sacrifice should end, because of Christ's sacrifice. So, but the way that these buildings were built like trees, it was an invitation to enter the tree that would suck up. The humanity would enter in, and then it would filter as the world burned in the eschaton at the end of time. It was going to filter out the sin. So it was the sin swallowing tree. And you would enter the tree because it was the only place to really be safe from the coming judgment. I said, well, that actually makes sense in the Christian story as well. And so these churches, then they continue to use this architecture, build. So even after they were converted, they would continue to build their churches in in the shape of trees. And what grows out of that architecture is Gothic cathedrals, right? Gothic cathedrals are the glorification of the buildings built shaped like trees that were a reminder of the cross using this Yggdrasil, this Yggdrasil tree poetic image. These images that came from this poetry that was it was converted. It was baptized. It was a way of helping their imaginations understand what it was that Christ had done. Right. So the Yggdrasil tree then is brought in to it is brought into the story of God's people the same sort of way the Levitical sacrifices are a part of the story of God's people. The Levitical sacrifices formed our imagination as God's people so that we could understand everything that the cross accomplished. Right? The cross doesn't just accomplish one thing; it accomplishes everything that and it takes those 7 sacrifices plus the other sacrifices plus all of the festivals plus all of the different things in the Old Testament, right? It takes 4,000 years to build up the images necessary to explain all that Christ accomplished on the cross and in the grave and in the resurrection. And when God comes and he grafts the Anglo-Saxon people in, he takes the Yggdrasil tree and he adds that to the story. Now, he doesn't add it in the same sort of way because Leviticus obviously is God's word and it's breathed by God and it's infallible. There's not, you couldn't have a higher understanding of the word of God as in its perfection and in its power then I don't think you can have too high of a view of the word of God, put it that way. But when God grafts us in, he brings other poetic images in and and grafts those in because that's part of our story as pagans that become Christians. And it has this amazing effect on, like, for example, the burial practices in Northern Europe shift and they change, right? They change from something that looks a little bit like Egyptian practices, where they give them things in order to make it across the river, the divide into the land of the dead. They bury them with treasures, that sort of thing, or often they send them out on boats with all of their treasures, light the boats on fire. That's why you still are finding all kinds of treasures in the water throughout England to Germany, right? They had these burial practices that were rejections of the body, right? They were burial practices that said the death has the final word, but death is an escape from the body. But what happens is the burial practices are all shifted and changed by the missionaries, but they don't become they aren't shifted into Mediterranean burial practices. They're not shifted into the burial practices of Israel, right? What happens is their burial practices are converted. So they begin burying them in pine boxes. Right now, we still do this to this day. We bury in pine boxes for this reason, because the pine is an evergreen, right? So it's the pine box, the coffin that we bury in is supposed to be a symbol of resurrection. Right? We've lost poetic our poetic vocabulary, but the coffin, it's not for health purposes, right? The coffin is a symbol of the coming resurrection, because we are entering the tree, we're entering the cross, we're becoming a part of the story of death, and the center of the story of death is Jesus's death on the cross. right? Every other death has been redefined by the cross, right? When Jesus breathed his last on the cross, death received a new center point, and now our death is related to that death, and so we bury in coffins, or we bury inside wood, because our death is a part of our death is in the cross. It's in Christ's death. It's defined by Christ's death. It's directly connected to Christ's death, and so we symbolically connect it with a wooden casket. And they also began pointing the feet of the people buried to the east. They started burning an Yggdrasil tree onto these coffins. Right, these are Christians that are doing this. Right, they have come up with a new burial practice, or their burial practice is converted into a hope-based burial practice where the body is honored. Right, the body is planted like a seed in a tree, because the expectation is it's going to come back up in the resurrection. So instead of surviving in surviving in the seasonal shape of history, just surviving through to the next spring, it takes on a directed sort of thing. History takes on a direction towards glory, but it's still a death and resurrection shaped glory. But now it's a hope filled death that's not a rejection of the body or an escape from the body, but the hope is that our spirit and our body will be reunited in the resurrection at the end of all things. There's other things that end up coming from it. The Christmas tree as a symbol is converted, with Yggdrasil turning its eyes to the light of Christ. It's baptized. There's different things, but maybe we'll talk about that around Christmas time. But I wanted to give an intermission and talk about something specific that is when we say religious, not spiritual. When we say our that we're saved in the flesh, we're saved into history. These sorts of things. That there's a real this has a real effect, because it's a completely different way of thinking about salvation, right? That we are saved into a new story. We're not saved out of our story, right? That all of our story is recentered around Christ and his death and resurrection, and is recentered as well around his coming, and it's really defined by the judgment at the end of time is the final real definition of everything, because everything that doesn't last, doesn't make it through, is given a different definition by the judgment, and then the judgment it has a refining effect as well. So that is a quick intermission in the podcast as we work through what it means to be religious and not spiritual.